When people talk about the greatest comic book characters of all time, the discussion tends to be reduced to the question of greatest comic book superheroes. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm certainly a fan of these characters as well, and for better or worse, superheroes are inextricably linked to the history of comics. But there is one character who is not a superhero, and yet he embodies the American dream better than Captain America or Superman. He's richer than Bruce Wayne, and he's only slightly less badass than Judge Dredd. I speak, of course, of Scrooge McDuck, the richest duck in the world. A frugal, hard-working Scottish immigrant to America, Scrooge is a self-made man who earned every cent of his fortune fairly. Well, most of it anyway. Scrooge McDuck is the maternal uncle of Donald Duck and great-uncle of Huey, Dewey, and Louie. While Scrooge's father would at one point be identified as Old Scotty McDuck and would eventually be known as Fergus McDuck, Scrooge's real father was the legendary writer and artist Carl Barks. In October of 1942, Barks' first Donald Duck comic, Donald Duck Finds Pirate Gold, was published in 4-color issue 9. Although Barks had merely worked on the book as an artist alongside fellow Duckman Jack Hanna and was not the main story man, it would be notable as his first foray into Duck comics. Barks had been handpicked by Walt Disney himself, along with Hanna, to draw the comic, an adaptation of an unmade feature film script. Unfortunately, life at the Disney studios during wartime was a much stuffier affair than the previous 7 years, during which Barks had heavily contributed to the character of Donald Duck, and Barks began to chafe at the tight security on the lot, as well as the creative limitations inherent in propaganda and educational films. It was only a month after Donald Duck Finds Pirate Gold was published that Barks would hand in his resignation letter to Disney personnel manager Hal Adelquist. In his letter, Barks said, "I have become tired of working for wages and have decided to make one reckless effort to survive on my own." So he moved with his second wife, Clara, to a small chicken ranch in San Jacinto, California, while he did his best to break into the comic book business. Barks immediately found work with Western Publishing, publishers of Disney Comics, who assigned him to the 10-page Donald Duck story, The Victory Garden. And soon, he had so much work on his hands, he didn't have time for his chickens. Over the next 8 years, Barks would distinguish the comic book Donald with cleverly written works of satire aimed at kids, but just as entertaining to adults, as well as fun adventure stories that could have been included in a pulp novel of the day. The Donald of these stories feels very much like a real person with dark and relatable impulses. Barks himself said that he viewed his duck characters as caricatures of human beings. I've seen this meme running around the internet, and what I'm saying basically explains this for anyone who's not into the Duck comics. Most importantly, the Donald of these comics is not limited by the vocabulary of Clarence Nash, the original voice of Donald. As the Donald writers were aware that certain phrases that Nash could speak were more reliably comprehensible to an audience than others, these phrases would tend to repeat. In the comics, Donald is much more expressive with language and much more sarcastic. But however much Barks expanded Donald's world, he was still only a character he had worked on, rather than his own creation. In 1947, Barks would introduce an original character that would become so popular he would escape the Disney comics and find his way to television, movie theaters, albums, and video games. Debuting in 4-color comics issue 178, Scrooge McDuck's first appearance saw him taking on the role of villain, much closer to his Dickensian source. In the story, titled Christmas on Bear Mountain, the wicked old miser Scrooge offers his nephew the use of his cabin for the winter holiday. Donald, generally being poor in these comics and not really having much that he can do with the nephews on Christmas, happily accepts. It turns out that this is all part of a frightening test by Scrooge to see if Donald is worthy of respect. Scrooge dresses up as a bear to scare Donald, and a real bear and her cub shows up, complicating things. In the end, Donald proves his bravery to Scrooge, and the old man seems to lighten up a bit. Indeed, Barks would alter the character of Scrooge after this, making him more frugal than selfish, although certainly cheap. One could compare this to the first appearance of characters like the Punisher, who started out as an antagonist to Spider-Man, but ended up as an anti-hero and eventually the star of his own comic. Anti-hero might be the very best way to describe Scrooge, and like Barks' depictions of Donald, it's this dark edge that makes Scrooge a more interesting character to follow. Scrooge's next appearance by Barks would be in 4-Color Comics issue 189, in a story called The Old Castle's Secret. This time, Scrooge approaches Donald and the boys about helping him find the McDuck family treasure, hidden somewhere in his old family castle back in Scotland, Dismal Downs. The treasure disappeared hundreds of years ago, and the McDucks have been searching for it ever since. Scrooge believes that this time he'll find the treasure for sure, since he'll be using an X-ray machine to see inside the walls. When they arrive at Dismal Downs, Scrooge and the others realize there's more to find there than just gold, when they seemingly end up dealing with the castle's ghost. It would be the first Donald Duck comic cover by Barks, as the covers were usually done by another artist. It would also be the first instance of Scrooge taking his family to search for treasure, but it would not be the last. Barks would continue to develop Scrooge in each new appearance. In 1949's Letter to Santa, published in Walt Disney's Christmas Parade issue 1, Scrooge acquires his customary attire of colorful coat, black top hat, and cane. Now, this is a matter of some debate. I have gone to Reddit and questioned other fans of the character of Scrooge and Barks in general to try to figure out exactly when Scrooge first acquires the outfit that we know him to wear. And here's what I think, in my opinion, okay? When Scrooge first shows up, he's basically got a robe on. I would call that like a, like the 1920s robe or whatever. That's what it looks like to me. Then later on, you do see him in this outfit that's kind of like the outfit we know him from, but it's not really. It makes sense it wouldn't be because it's all thick and it's supposed to keep him warm during the cold, so fine. But I don't think that's his usual outfit. I just don't see it that way. Again, in his appearances after this, he tends to have this green, or whatever color, because, I'm looking at the Fantagraphics versions a lot of the time, and those versions have different colors for some of the reprints, and so I don't know which color is always necessarily the correct color. But what I can say is that it looks like he's wearing a robe for a lot of the time, and then in Voodoo Hoodoo, he appears to, for the first time, wear what would basically be his outfit, except it's black and it has green trim. So to me, even though it's the same, like if you were to make it black and white, and there are some reprintings of these comics that are black and white, so if you're reading those, you're probably like, okay, that's the first time he ever had his outfit that we know him to have. But as far as I can tell, the first time that he has his outfit and it's in color is in Letter to Santa. And again, I'm not entirely sure with the original color. I think the original color was blue, which is kind of interesting because of later iterations of the character also used blue. But in reprints, the character is in red because ultimately Scrooge became known as wearing red. That became his thing. Anyway, went a bit off script for this part because I kind of needed to, just to sort of explain that. As far as I'm concerned, the first time he wears his classic outfit is in Letter to Santa. But there's going to be other Barks fans that are going to bicker with me on that, and I perfectly understand. If you want to bicker with me on that in the comments, go ahead. One of the best Scrooge stories from the Donald comics is called A Financial Fable. In this story, Huey, Dewey, and Louie are enjoying working on Scrooge's farm, while their Uncle Donald would rather be lazy. It's revealed to the reader that Scrooge keeps his fortune in a massive corn crib, hoping to hide it from thieves. Soon, a cyclone appears and sucks up all of Scrooge's money. Luckily, Scrooge was underneath the corn crib at the time, keeping him safe. The boys tell Scrooge that his money is gone, and he says, "So what? If I stay here and tend to my beans and pumpkins, I'll get it all back." The money ends up in the hands of people all over the world, including Donald and his cousin Gladstone Gander. When Donald and Gladstone try to spend the money on gas at a fancy dinner, they find that nobody is working anymore because they don't have to, and they can't get the services they need. Back at the farm, Scrooge arms the kids to protect the crops. Wow, things got all trigger effect real quick. Some people come from all over to buy food from Scrooge's farm, and he charges them millions, easily making his money back. The story obviously predates Scrooge's money bin, but it's pure Scrooge and its economic wisdom. Real-world comparisons are easy to make, including Germany and Zimbabwe, and for some of us, a bit closer to home. Barks' one reckless effort to survive on his own had succeeded. He'd spent 8 years following his dreams and making some of the greatest American comics ever produced, but the years had not been easy for him. Barks had met his then-wife, Clara, while living in Minneapolis in 1931. Clara was considered a beautiful woman, with Barks himself comparing her to movie star Marlene Dietrich. Barks would teach his wife to be an inker, and she would help him with his work. When she was sober, at least. According to Barks, Clara had come from a family with a long history of alcoholism, something she'd been unable to escape. As time went on, Clara's drinking would grow worse, and she would sometimes become hostile, tearing up whole pages that Barks had drawn, and, on one occasion, throwing them into the dirt. Clara's drinking would also cost her her looks, with her nose becoming distorted by nerve damage. Finally, towards the end of 1951, the couple underwent a nasty divorce. According to Barks, his ex-wife would end up with his entire estate, with the exception of 2 blankets, Barks' clothes, his drawing board, and his collection of National Geographic magazines, which Barks had often used as reference for his stories set in exotic locales. Barks was now 50 years old, penniless and alone, but he still had his art. At some point in 1951, Western Publishing had sent Barks a letter asking if he could write and draw a 32-page comic book based around the character of Scrooge. Barks felt that the character had not been fleshed out enough up to this point, and so he began to conceive of a story that would perfectly encapsulate the character. Barks had begun working on this comic while still married to Clara, and it had not been easy to finish. Still, in March of 1952, 4-color issue 386 would be the very first issue of the Walt Disney Uncle Scrooge comic book. Although it is technically 4-color issue 386, it is also technically Uncle Scrooge number 1. Only a poor old man. The story begins as Scrooge is swimming through his money. Scrooge says he likes to dive around in his money like a porpoise and burrow through it like a gopher. Scrooge tells Donald that having a fortune will give him peace of mind, and then immediately freaks out and kills a moth with a blunderbuss because moths eat paper and they might eat all of his greenbacks. Scrooge is happy when he sees his trap caught a rat, since the rat could have chewed up all of his greenbacks. He then kills a spider to keep its web from short-circuiting his alarm system. Suddenly, Scrooge sees that the nefarious Beagle Boys have shown up and are in the process of erecting a building right next to his money bin, with the obvious intention of using it to break in and steal Scrooge's money, which causes him to faint. When Huey, Dewey, and Louie ask Scrooge why his money is so important, he explains that his fortune is essentially a record of all his struggles and accomplishments, telling them that every coin has a story. One of the boys asks if Scrooge made his money in banking, and he responds with a snort. "I made it on the seas and in the mines, in the cattle wars of the old frontier." Scrooge isn't rich because his dad owned an emerald mine. He's rich because he's smarter than the smarties and tougher than the toughies. This actually explains why Scrooge loves to swim in his money. He's essentially swimming in his own accomplishments and feeling nostalgia for his past. Ironically, a time when he was mostly broke. "You'd love your money too," Scrooge says, "if you got it the way I did." One might question if everything Scrooge did to get rich was ethical, but it seems clear that it was at least ethical to Scrooge. Square, as he puts it. I don't want to spoil this story, as I recommend you read it yourself, but to sum it up, what follows is a series of headaches that Scrooge has to deal with in order to keep his money. The story establishes a more complicated version of Scrooge, and the one that most fans would come to know. At the end of the story, Donald says that Scrooge's fortune isn't worth all the trouble that it brings. He accepts his pay after giving Scrooge a good kick in the butt, and calls him a poor old man. But Scrooge shrugs off his nephew's words as kid talk, saying that no man is poor who can do what he wants to do once in a while. And of course, Scrooge wants to swim in his money. One of the interesting aspects of the comic book Scrooge is that, typically speaking, the majority of his money is depicted as being silver, in contrast with later iterations of the character. This is a subtle piece of evidence that Scrooge really did earn his money and didn't just inherit it, since silver was traditionally the currency of the poor. Of course, in Voodoo Hoodoo, Scrooge says he gained control of some land in Africa by hiring some thugs to chase off the local tribesmen. But this story takes place before Only a Poor Old Man, and so Scrooge was still in a semi-villainous phase. Even after Scrooge got his own book, Barks wasn't always strict on continuity. In The Round Money Bin, Scrooge decides that he's being too sentimental about his coins, and he has them transferred into greenbacks in order to more easily hide his money from the Beagle Boys. But, spoilers, by the end of the story he decides that coins are better to have and switches it all back. Then, in the very next Scrooge story, The Menahune Mystery, he does it again. He transfers all of his coins into greenbacks, so you can see that Barks would kind of just do whatever he wanted for each story, even if there was a basic continuity. And none of that is to whitewash any of the bad things that you can technically nail Scrooge with. Another author, later on, would actually attempt to address this, but we'll get to that later in the video. Only a Poor Old Man sold well enough for Barks to continue making Scrooge stories. In 1960, the first year that sales data would be included in statements of ownership, Walt Disney's Uncle Scrooge was revealed to be the best-selling comic book in the United States, beating out characters such as Batman or Superman. The character, quite appropriately, had appeared toward the end of the golden age of comics, but would continue on into the Silver Age. Along with the Beagle Boys, Barks would later add the evil witch Magica de Spell to Scrooge's Rogues Gallery. Barks would later say, "She brought in an opportunity to kid this Superman stuff, the super witches and the weird things that you find in some of the other comics." He would also create the wealthy villains Flintheart Glomgold and John D. Rockerduck. In many ways, these characters acted as foils for Scrooge, demonstrating what truly villainous rich men were like. But in other ways, they're just good matches for Scrooge, since they have at least similar resources to his. These days, copies of the old Donald Duck and Uncle Scrooge comics can sell for thousands, though luckily there are plenty of reprints and collections to pick up. For many people, though, their introduction to Uncle Scrooge was through the 1987 television series DuckTales, which had been loosely based on Barks' Scrooge comics. A number of episodes act as very loose adaptations of Barks' stories. In the very first episode, we even get a few direct quotes from the comics, such as Scrooge saying that he loves to dive around in his money like a porpoise and burrow through it like a gopher, and also Scrooge repeating his famous claim that he's smarter than the smarties and tougher than the toughies. There's a lot of episodes of the show that I could talk about and compare to various, Barks stories, but I'll just talk about a specific one. Do-Re-Mi is essentially a financial fable, and they're very different. The two stories are actually very different. Do-Re-Mi is about a machine that copies things, and so because he can copy things, they copy money and so on. It's actually very different. As an adaptation, and I don't even know, theoretically you could say maybe it was an adaptation, maybe they didn't even know about the original comic and they just came up with it. I don't think so, though. I think it was deliberate. And of course, Scrooge also does mention inflation as a problem in his very first theatrical appearance, Scrooge McDuck and Money, but that is a very different Scrooge. It's I don't consider them to be exactly the same character, or at the very least I consider it to be an adaptation, a different adaptation of the Barks character. The series would also spawn a theatrical film in 1990, DuckTales the Movie, Treasure of the Lost Lamp, which has some pretty good animation in my book, though certainly not up to the standards of the Disney films before and after, and it wasn't much of a success, with future sequels being canceled. One of the nice things I really like about the DuckTales movie is that there's a lot of moments where Scrooge just looks like he's basically evil. Like he's just like, I'm gonna get that. I'm greedy. I'm gonna get this stuff. He's almost like Quark from Deep Space Nine, in some moments. This whole time, Scrooge had still been a regular fixture in the comic world, with the Barks stories being reprinted by Gladstone Publishing from 1986 to 1990. Gladstone had begun as a subsidiary of Another Rainbow Publishing, a company created in 1981 by Bruce Hamilton and Russ Cochran, who would also reprint black and white copies of the old EC comics. When Disney saw how well the Barks comics were selling, they revoked Gladstone's license and began publishing the comics themselves. This experiment was short-lived, lasting only until 1993, but it would result in one of the greatest comic book storylines ever written. A lifelong fan of Scrooge and Donald, writer and artist Don Rosa had been making comics about the characters since 1986, when he started working for Gladstone. This lasted until 1989. 2 years later, about a year after the DuckTales series had ended and the movie was released in theaters, Disney was now in charge of their own comics, and they wanted a new miniseries telling the life of Scrooge McDuck. When Rosa heard about the project, he immediately told his publisher, Edgemont, that the project should be handled by a true fan of the material. Edgemont got the hint, and Rosa ended up getting the job. Rosa made a list of all the various bits of Barksian lore that Scrooge fans had collected over the years, and began sketching up a story that would incorporate all of these things into a stable continuity, to be titled The Life and Times of Scrooge McDuck. As Rosa himself has made clear, this is not the Barks Scrooge, but rather Rosa's version of the character. As such, there is a general sense of reverence here that seems more pronounced than in much of Carl Barks' work, though I feel it's still accurate to the spirit of Barks' Scrooge, especially the Poor Old Man version. Spanning from 1877 to 1947, the story takes us through Scrooge's entire life, leading up to the events of the Old Castle's secret, with an emphasis on his early failures and accomplishments. This gives the story an epic tone and makes it feel like a meditation on life and loss. Rosa even reinterprets the Voodoo Hoodoo story as representing the one deed Scrooge committed to gain his fortune that he himself would call unethical, and which he deeply regrets. Some fans object to these changes, also pointing out the spotty continuity in the Barks stories, but personally, I consider The Life and Times of Scrooge McDuck not so much a sequel to the Barks comics as an addendum to them, a brilliant tribute to the work of Carl Barks, and to a character loved by thousands. One question that's often asked is, just how much money does Scrooge actually have? Assuming that we're talking about the comic book Scrooge, this is very hard to assess. Like I said, most of his money is usually depicted as consisting of precious metals. This means that you'd have to first decide if you were trying to calculate the face value of Scrooge's fortune or the actual value of the metals. I also rarely see people separating Scrooge's money bin money from his overall net worth when trying to figure this out. Forbes magazine stated that Scrooge has a net worth of $65.4 billion, ranking him number one in their 2013 edition, the final edition, by the way, of the Forbes Fictional 15. But I have no idea how they came to this conclusion. At the beginning of Only a Poor Old Man, Barks says that Scrooge has up-teen centrifugillion dollars. In the episode of DuckTales titled Liquid Assets, very loosely based on Only a Poor Old Man, Fenton Crackshell states that the number is 600 centillion, 386 zillion, 947 trillion, 522 billion dollars and 36 cents. Don Rosa's Life and Times of Scrooge McDuck states that Scrooge has 5 multiplugillion, 9 impossibillion, 7 fantastica trillion dollars, and 16 cents. Obviously, these numbers are not real, but there is another way of measuring Scrooge's wealth that is consistent enough for me to name it as accurate. According to both the original Carl Barks comics and the original DuckTales TV show, Scrooge says, and is said by others, to possess a cash reserve measured at 3 cubic acres. Now, a cubic acre is not a thing, but internet blogger DEBT over at Sunday Comics debt.blogspot points out that in the letters section from 1991's Uncle Scrooge number 252, a reader by the name of Flash Kellum from Austin, Texas, proposes a method for measuring in cubic acres. I'm not particularly good at math, nor am I a super genius, despite some people's claims, and I can't really summarize it here, so I'm just going to read an excerpt directly from Kellum's letter. Dear Editor, I thought I might share with your readers some calculations I have made concerning the size and shape of Scrooge's money bin. My calculations are, as you will see, based on a bizarre but necessary assumption. First, as we all know, Uncle Scrooge possesses 3 cubic acres of money, but there is no such thing as a cubic acre. An acre is a measure of an area, or, in mathematical terms, a square measure. That is, one that deals with two spatial dimensions. If, theoretically speaking, a unit of area were to be cubed, we would find ourselves wrestling with 6 spatial dimensions. Such an object, of course, cannot exist in the real world, which operates on the basis of 3 spatial dimensions. Thus, in order to make any calculations, I have to assume that a cubic acre is a volume which, were it in the shape of a cube, would have 6 faces each with an area of 1 acre. An acre comprises 43,560 square feet. Thus, an area of 1 acre in the shape of a square would have to have 4 sides each approximately 206.71 feet long. By my assumption, therefore, a cubic acre is a cubical object with 12 edges, each 208.71 feet in length. That would give a cubic acre a volume of approximately 9,091,380 cubic feet. 3 cubic acres, therefore, would have a volume of approximately 22,274,140 cubic feet. A reader named Doug Hooley of Boulder, Colorado, would use Kellum's letter, as well as the then market price of gold and silver, as a basis for calculating that, according to him, Scrooge has $96 trillion, which is about $227 trillion in 2025 dollars. Inflation strikes again. One thing that is certain is that most rankings of Scrooge's wealth place it well above that of characters such as Bruce Wayne. Even more impressive when we consider that this money was earned by Scrooge personally. It's for these reasons that Scrooge is still remembered to this day. Barks himself would be remembered as a legend, with notable fans such as George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, who actually took the rolling boulders scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark from the Scrooge story The 7 Cities of Gold. The same year that Only a Poor Old Man was published, Barks would meet his third wife, Margaret Winifred Barletta Williams. The couple would remain together until Margaret's death in 1993. Since 2015, Scrooge has been the star of a comic book published by IDW. In 2017, a new DuckTales show premiered on August 12th on Disney XD. The show contains numerous references to both the Barks and Rosa Scrooge comics, although in my opinion it feels much more influenced by the Rosa version, although it is its own original story. In 2023, Fantagraphics published The Life and Times of Scrooge McDuck, the Dragon of Glasgow, a prequel Scrooge story. And in 2024, Marvel Comics released their first ever Scrooge comic, Uncle Scrooge and the Infinity Don. When comparing Scrooge to other famous comic book characters, one can see that his stories have all the action, adventure, humor, and beauty that a reader could ask for, as well as some valuable gold nuggets of wisdom to carry with us, whether we travel to faraway lands or just stay at home with a book. If you've never read any of the Scrooge stories, check out your local comic book shop for some cheap reprints. You may notice that the images of the comics I use here will vary in quality. That's because the totally legal site that I was using was shut down, and I had to use another totally legal site to get the rest of the images. You could also read these comics on a similar site, but I recommend reading actual physical copies, whether they be reprints or collections. Like Scrooge, I also believe that every piece of money I own tells a story, so why not tell me a story by sending me $1 over on Patreon? Thanks again to channel members, or really just channel member, effing with the S, you rock, and I'll see you guys next time.